the new one is called Suffragette Fascists, and it explores the anti-Semitism of Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes, and also the way that they foreshadowed the rise of the fascist movements in the 1930s. They were a very strange bunch of people. They were financed by wealthy and aristocratic backers, and of course they used a lot of terrorism against working class people.
Yeah, could we talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's another blind spot in people's understanding, is that when we hear the term suffragettes, we think that was a real noble cause of women fighting for the right to vote for all women. But in reality, they were just they were effectively domestic terrorists. They were like Antifa, and they were bombing London, right? They were
Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey was bombed.
Yeah,
bombs all over the place. They weren't actually fighting for the right for all women to have a vote.
Yeah.
The slogan we all remember is "Votes for Women," but on their publications and on their leaflets, they had printed on every single one, "The Women's Social and Political Union are not fighting for the right for every woman to have a vote. They only wanted middle-class women to have votes, and university-educated people and property owners."
That's right. We have this understanding that it's, all men had the vote and no women had the vote, and then the suffragists and the suffragettes came in and they managed to get all the women to the vote. But actually, they didn't want like you say, they didn't want all women to vote. And actually, only about wasn't it only about a third of men had the vote anyway?
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
And wasn't that to do with the fact that they had a certain amount of property? So you could only have the vote if you had X amount of property or property value. And
that's absolutely correct.
And wasn't there also a connection into, I know this is the case in America, but like being able to serve, being part of the draft to go to war, that gave you certain voting rights as well. I'm not sure if that's the same in England, but because
it wasn't the case in England. In England, conscription didn't start in England. There was no such thing as conscription until 1916, and then it was every man between the age of 18 and 40.
Every man between 18 and 40.
Every man, 40. Yeah. When the suffragettes started their activity, it was about half of men, about 40% of men couldn't vote in this country because there was a property condition. Yeah, you had to be a ratepayer, had property. So if you just rented a home and you were fairly poor, you didn't have a vote as a man. Women could not only have a vote at that time on local authorities, they could stand as councillors. Many were elected as councillors.
This was before the suffragettes, right? This was before the advent.
Yes, before the suffragettes, yes. Yeah, everything was moving in the direction of women having the vote when the suffragettes started carrying on.
Mm. Yeah, the suffragists were slowly putting things together to be able to have their equal rights.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's at that time the government couldn't be seen giving way to terrorism. There was a lot of trouble in Ireland, as it so often was in those days, and we had a confrontation with Germany. The government had to appear strong. If we gave way to terrorism, then it would have made the government look weak, and the Germans and the Irish both would have seen a good opportunity. They would have thought that Asquith's government was a pushover. Mm. So as soon as the suffragettes turned to terrorism, it meant that immediately their demands couldn't be met.
Oh, they couldn't be met. So we're told that, like, because of their actions, that things were sped up, and they. No,
it's not fair.
And Emily was it Emily Davidson, the one that threw herself under the royal's horse, the king's what was it?
Emily Davison was a terrorist. She blew up Lloyd George's house. Emily Davison was one of the first person to plant a terrorist bomb in England in the 20th century. She also instigated a campaign of arson. And while we're talking of Emily Davison, no one ever seems to remember Herbert Jones. Do you know the name at all?
No, I don't know.
Okay. Herbert Jones was a jockey. If I see a horse galloping along at 30 miles an hour, forget my politics for a moment. If I go along and I see a horse galloping at 30 miles an hour and they weigh about a quarter of a ton, if I run up to it and start messing around and frightening it, there's a very good chance there's going to be an accident, isn't there?
Yeah.
What happened was that Herbert Jones, who was a jockey, the horse reared up and landed on top of him. He was nearly killed.
She died, obviously.
She died, but she very nearly committed murder. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's manslaughter, isn't it?
Well, if you do something deliberately that's likely to cause harm, it's more like murder. The
Exactly.
police were getting ready to charge her with GBH before she died.
Oh, right, yeah. But we remember as a hero, as a heroine. It's crazy, isn't it?
Well, yeah, if you want to make a heroine out of a suicide bomber, then yes, I
Yeah, then
suppose you
yes,
must think of
but
a heroine.
that's the way that they write the history books. And Emmeline
True.
Pankhurst as well.
Yes.
She was also responsible for
She got
terrorist.
3 years at the Old Bailey for inciting terrorism. Yeah.
Isn't this amazing? Again, this is just another like a hazy part of our understanding of everything.
Well,
That's just the way it is. It just goes to show that, and especially the ones that you critique and criticize and pull apart, there's an immunity to criticism. And that's when every time there's an immunity to criticism or critique, I suddenly have to go, why is that?
well, yes, that's right.
Well, can we also just then let's tie the loop on the rights to vote. So we talked about how the only 40% of the men had the right to vote.
Yeah,
Women were able to vote in local elections and stand for local council.
that's right. Yes.
But then, what were the significant historical markers then? What were the various points at which things started to change? So,
the First World War was the trigger for women being given the vote generally. But I mean, there's a lot of mythology attached to that as well. Sometimes it's claimed that they were given the vote because of all the war work they did, and it meant people recognised that they deserved to vote because they did so much while the men were at the front. But of course, that's all nonsense.
So, what was the actual real reason?
The real reason was everyone else was being given. All other countries are giving women the vote as well. Women had been given the vote in Australia back in the 1890s. The Isle of Man had given the vote to women. It was just how people realised by that time that it was an anachronism just having men voting. All over the world, women were being given the vote without having to have suffragettes or campaigns or anything. It was just that with the end of the First World War, the modern world started sort of coming into being, and people realised that it was only reasonable for women to have the vote.
Yeah. So we actually didn't really need the suffragettes at all.
No, of course.